Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to this week's program, which is 10 things about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. A fascinating conversation. So, why did we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th? The 13th abolishes slavery. The 15th gives black men the right to vote, and the 14th has an equal protection and due process clause. It's meant to make sure that the Bill of Rights is applied in its fundamental ways equally across the country and not abrogated in certain states, in this case former Confederate states. And it also, of course, has the birthright clause that anyone who is born in this country, period, is a citizen of the United States. So, there's a lot of backlash against that in certain quarters now. You probably heard it on the Republican debate stage. Several people saying, yes, we need to abolish the birthright citizenship clause. We are unusual in this. If you're born in Sweden, you don't have birthright citizenship. If you're born in Finland, you don't have birthright citizenship. This is part of the great dream, the great experiment. What a wild and wonderful experiment. That and truly, for all the problems of the United States, the idea of creating a polyglot nation with many ethnicities and religions and source geographies of people from all over the world who come here, and they do mostly blend in really quickly. Their children almost invariably speak English, certainly their grandchildren. They don't usually stay in sequestered enclaves. They blend in. And most immigrants historically have wanted to become Americans first, and Polish Americans second, and Americans first, and Italian Americans second. That varies a little bit from time to time, but on the whole, that's the way it's been. It's been an astonishingly successful experiment, not without great tensions. The Chinese exclusion laws, or the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II, or the apartheid, which has enormous tenacity even now. But still, on the whole, we have been wildly successful in this, and maybe the trajectory is bent towards justice. It doesn't really feel that at the moment, but I think we're in a particularly disillusioned, even cynical moment here. I'm sitting in my living room. It's fall, my goodness. Outside the house, on the front curb, is Rocinante, my Airstream. It's spectacular. It is actually magnificent. I've been camping in it for the last week. Now it's about time to winterize it. It has a couple little things that have to get worked out, a valve here and a switch there, some electrical things, but tiny things, and some of it, of course, human error. So that's very exciting, and I'm beginning to plan in a very serious way, next year. And I want to recommend to all of you, because we'll be talking more and more about this, a book called Romance of the Road, The Literature of the American Highway by Ronald Primo. Romance of the Road, The Literature of the American Highway, Ronald Primo. It's a little bit academic in the beginning, a little bit too much theory, but if you sail through that, it starts to get much more interesting as it goes. And it's really helping me think about what a big road adventure is. And one of the things you learn is that you don't want to over-plan it, because things need to happen that you don't expect. That part of it is meeting exigencies, possibilities, challenges, impediments, digressions, diversions, problems like the breakdown of your engine, or the decoupling of the Airstream on a mountaintop. You can't over prepare. If you do, you can't be open to the experience. So that's part of it. And I'm trying to decide in my own case whether this is a pilgrimage or a feat, I'm going to follow Steinbeck's trip all the way around, or a search for self. People at loose ends like William Least Moon, having lost a relationship and his job, went out on the road on the blue highways and rediscovered America, but rediscovered himself. A lot of these are about self-discovery. Many different reasons to do this, or open exploration. Steinbeck went out in search of the soul of America. I don't think he really found it, but that's another question. So in my case, I'm definitely going to do some pilgrimage work. I've been trying to make lists. I definitely want to go to Muhammad Ali's Interpretive Center in Louisville. I definitely want to go to the birthplace of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I definitely want to go to Jack Kerouac's grave outside of New York City. I definitely want to go to the last home of one of my heroes, John Wesley Powell, on the coast of Maine. I definitely want to return to Monticello and Poplar Forest to the source of the great life and achievement of my particular hero in the world, Thomas Jefferson. I want to go to some battlefields. I think these battlefields are also important. They're sort of America's Dachau, going to Wounded Knee, for example. Part of it is just the joy of being out on the road, the enormous sense of letting go and leaving your cares behind, and sort of almost in some metaphoric way, walking or driving off the map of the known world and just to see what happens. And there are so many parts of this country that I've really never seen. I've been in every one of the 50 states, but that's really belt-notching rather than a significant study. There are many states I don't know much about at all, most of them in the East. I've only barely been to Maine. I've been to New Hampshire quite a bit, Vermont some, not upstate New York nearly enough, Western Pennsylvania not nearly enough, the Carolinas not nearly as much as I would like, Georgia barely, and not much in the interior. I'm looking forward to that, but that's no reason to enlist all of you. Enlisting all of you is because I wanted to examine the United States at 250 years old and see if I can discern its mood and its attitude and its concerns and its pride and its shames, to see what's unresolved and to get a sense from the American people of how they feel about this great experiment at this point. So all of that is coming. I look out on the rig out there. It's getting cold. It's time for it to go into winter storage, that's for sure. But it's a glorious thing, and I could not be more excited about it. But today, Lindsay Chervinsky, and we continue to do our 10 Things series. We've done a bunch of them. They're really very interesting, I think. This one was about the post-war amendments to the Constitution of the United States. She has started her third book, which she says is going to be about the presidencies of Ulysses S. Grant and Dwight David Eisenhower and the similarities in their presidential terms. So thanks for listening. Contribute if you can, please. That would be great. Get this book, Romance of the Road, The Literature of the American Highway by Ronald Primo. I'm also reading Travel to Charlie, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Blue Highways, On the Road, etc. So thanks, everyone. I love you. You have no idea how much your support has meant to me and means to me and is going to mean to me in the couple of years, 4 or 5 years ahead. So let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Across from me is one of my favorite people in the world and a great historian, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, now having finished her second book, more probably on the way. And today our subject is the post-Civil War amendments, particularly the 14th. Welcome, Dr. Chervinsky.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You're one of my favorite people, too.
It's a deal. I love this. I met you accidentally because you wrote a great book. Zoom allowed us to start to work together. Now we work together a lot. People love it. It's exciting. And we do these programs called 10 Things. They sort of range all over history. Some of them are more playful than others. This week it's the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Let me start by saying we don't amend the Constitution very often. The first 10 came right off the bat as the Bill of Rights, then a couple of sort of procedural things. It's not until the Civil War, and in fact the aftermath of the war, that we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Then there's another sort of quiescent period until the Progressive Era, when we get income tax and direct election of senators. And then we have Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, where we get a few tune-ups in the 1960s, the abolishing of poll tax and 18-year-olds can vote and so on. But there aren't many. And the last amendment to the Constitution of the United States came in 1992. It was the 27th, and it was about congressional salaries, so not of great importance to the American people. So do you agree that we're very reluctant to amend the Constitution, but after a crisis like the Civil War, we sort of have no choice?
Yeah, the way I see amendments kind of shaping up is there was a whole flurry at the beginning, sort of to close some of the loopholes that they saw either in practice or to resolve promises that had been made in order to secure the ratification. And then we've seen bouts of them at other sort of big pivotal moments, often sort of, I think, sort of when there are tectonic social shifts. So I sort of see like the prohibition and the suffrage amendments as like a big tectonic social shift. And of course, the post-Civil War amendments are in that same ideas. There's this huge change in society and the country because of the war. Now, by that argument, we should have had a lot more at other various moments with huge social shifts. Certainly we had, things like the 25th Amendment, which I think is important, although of course has never really, it's kind of been utilized once when Reagan went under surgery, but never really. But I think, as you and I have discussed, I was actually just listening to our Constitutional Convention conversation this morning, and we're really overdue for a lot of constitutional amendments.
So, as you say, these times of social unrest or social movement, periods of great dynamism or crisis, a lot of them have been to extend the franchise beyond the white males who wrote the Constitution in 1787. So you get black men in the 15th Amendment. The 14th also tries to enforce some of that. Women's suffrage in the 1920s, 18-year-old vote, an abolishing of poll taxes, prohibition of poll taxes. All of those have been designed over time to make sure that everybody has a chance to vote in the elections of the United States, to the point now where it's universal suffrage except for certain felons and for people younger than 18 years old.
Well, and I think also a lot of the amendments are defining what it means to be a citizen, because there are multiple facets of that concept. So it's not just voting, it's due process, it's privacy, it's protection of various civil liberties. And so I think that and one of the elements of our conversation today is sometimes it's not clear where the limitations or the ends of citizenship start and stop until you're actually trying to enforce it in practice or you're dealing with court cases. And so a lot of times the amendments are a recognition that either there were these constitutional silences before and there were assumptions that needed to be clarified, or there were loopholes that needed to be closed in certain ways. And so one of the things that I think is so interesting about these amendments is it really does get at all of the different ways that one is a citizen, what that means in practice, and how people were in real time responding to organic challenges, trying to sort of identify that and quantify that in constitutional language.
And we also learned that sometimes the amendment has to say, no, we really mean it, when an earlier amendment seemed to solve the problem, but it didn't. And so then you have to go back in and say, no, we really meant it.
For realsies, no take-backsies.
Exactly. Well, there you go again. Number 13, abolishing slavery, passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, ratified December 6th, 1865. Fascinating that Abraham Lincoln was alive when it went through Congress, but not alive when it was ratified. The 14th Amendment passed Congress June 13th, 1866, but not ratified till July 9th, 1868. By the way, as I'm sure you know, it is by far the most litigated passage in the Constitution of the United States. 15th Amendment passed Congress February 26, 1869, and was ratified on February 3rd, 1870. I should just remind our listeners that a constitutional amendment has a very high bar. 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the states must go ahead and also affirm that amendment. So today I think you would say nearly impossible to contemplate.
Yes. I don't think that we could get 2/3 or 3/4 of Americans to agree on anything, including like what color the sky was.
So that's a problem because, as you know, with the Articles of Confederation, one of their failures was that changing them required unanimous consent. And everyone realized, I get why we did it, because we were still reacting to British tyranny, but that's not going to work. So then we created the Constitution in 1787 with a high bar, but one that they thought was capable of being met. It has been met 27 times, but in this climate, it just seems to me that it's a statistical impossibility. So that's a problem, right? Because we do need to change the Constitution.
It is, and it can't be blamed purely on partisanship because, for example, if you look at the 12th Amendment, which was passed to clarify how the president and vice president are elected to prevent the sort of tie that we saw in the election of 1800, the 1790s and the early 1800s were a moment of intense partisanship. I mean, just ruthless, awful, terrible nastiness. And yet they were able to come together to pass this thing because they recognized that it was important for good governance. And then the states ratified it. So it can't just be blamed on the partisanship of the current moment, but rather sort of a decrease in understanding of civic virtue and the value of governance. And I would argue also a position of one of the parties on really not wanting to govern, on wanting to kind of destroy the government. And whereas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans wanted small government or limited government, they didn't want no government. They weren't trying to tear it apart. And so I think that fundamental gridlock is relatively unusual in American history.
Excellent point, Lindsay. And I've been reading all these books. Rick Stengel, the Rhodes classmate of mine from Oxford, has written an article about 8 books you must read about the dangers of democracy and the rise of fascism. I've got them all right here, and I'm reading them. And they all agree on one thing. It all begins to break down when there is no peaceful and agreed upon transfer of power. We're there now, of course, at least rhetorically. And that's what they were attempting to do in the 12th Amendment, is to make sure that the election of 1800 didn't happen again, that the election would have a greater clarity, that there would be a winner, that we wouldn't want it to go into the House of Representatives except under very unusual circumstances. One way to do that is to separate the ticketing of president and vice president, and they solved the problem for most of American history.
They did, and lest anyone think that this is not a relevant issue, I was listening to an interview the other day that was talking about the no labels, attempt to be placed on the ballot in the 2024 election. And what they stated as sort of their backup goal is that they wanted to get a couple of states such that no other candidate could reach 270, the required number in the Electoral College. And so the election would have to go to the House of Representatives. And I think that there are good faith reasons why that would maybe happen, but to intentionally try and seek that out is, I think, such a dangerous concept and such a perversion of the people's right to vote and select their own leaders. And so this is very much an ever-present problem.
Indeed, and we may see it come to haunt us in just over a year now. There is a fairly good chance, I think the best in my lifetime, that the election would be thrown into the House of Representatives if nobody reaches the 270 majority trigger point in the Electoral College. All right, let's get started here. On your list of the 10 points we might make about this is that we could consider the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as the second founding. Explain.
Well, if we think of the founding era as first an articulation of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness by your main man, TJ, and then as the Constitution as sort of a part 2, an attempt to make that functional for most white men in 1787. These amendments attempt to make that functional for all men. And so if we think about what it means to have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, you have to have citizenship, you have to have personal autonomy, you have to have the right to vote, you have to have due process, all of these really essential things. And until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they were very much limited as to who those rights apply to. So if we think about when we start to get a majority of people who are able to participate in the American concept of liberty, these amendments are really one of the sort of key foundational moments when that comes to be.
We need to take a break here in a minute, but the Civil War occurs. It's a bloody, awful war, almost 800,000 dead, an enormous cataclysm for the United States, a nightmare for a constitutional republic. And the North wins the war, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen in the aftermath. And so these amendments have to be proposed and ratified in order to make the war's purposes meaningful in constitutional law. And that's a very difficult process. It worked. I'm a little astonished almost that we get them. Partly, of course, it was a price of readmission into the Union, and so that put some useful pressure on the former Confederate states. We're going to continue to talk about this. We need to take a short break. You're listening to this special edition of Listening to America. Today's guest, Lindsay Chervinsky. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson talking with my dear friend Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, we proposed this together. I think we're both fascinated by this. And as you know, the 14th Amendment is sort of back in the news in different ways, back in the law in a couple of ways. Two of them that we'll come back to, I think, in the third segment. Number one, there's a fairly widespread group of Republicans, many of them on the debate stage recently, who've said we should rescind birthright citizenship in the United States, which is one of the guarantees of the 14th Amendment. And other people are now saying that perhaps Donald Trump is ineligible to run again for the presidency because he was involved in an insurrection. We'll leave those for the moment, but it tells you how important the 14th Amendment has become in American life. I want to go to the 15th for a moment. So the 15th is the one that says black men can vote. That had to be a terrible blow to the suffrage movement.
Yeah, I think the 15th is so interesting because it says that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, previous iterations of that amendment, when they were discussing it in Congress, also included things like property, which I think would have potentially made things like poll taxes, which were a pretty key element of the Jim Crow laws in the South, and somewhat in the North too, would have probably made that ineligible a lot earlier. And of course, there's no mention of sex or gender, and those were also bandied about. And they were bandied about for different reasons because the idea of the vote came down to, why is it granted to people? Is it granted to people because you're a citizen, or is it granted to people because of service? And so a lot of women, people like Susan B. Anthony, many of whom had been pretty vocal abolitionists, said women are citizens, which they were at that point. They're citizens. Therefore, they should have the right to vote. Full citizenship means also getting to express your voice in that way. And a lot of Black activists, people like Frederick Douglass, said all of these Black soldiers served with incredible valor. They demonstrated their loyalty to the nation. They demonstrated that they were good citizens, and therefore they should receive the right to vote. And no form of literacy requirement was imposed on white men, and so therefore no form of literacy requirement should be imposed on Black men. Both of these things were unpopular. There were people who didn't like the idea of Black men voting, and there were people who didn't like the idea of women voting. Basically, it was a trade-off, is which one is going to be more beneficial to the people in Congress. And a lot of people in Congress concluded Black men, especially Black men in the South, were going to be the most loyal citizens. They were going to be the most loyal Republican voters. You couldn't necessarily guarantee that all white women would vote Republican, and would provide perhaps more stability for the nation. That was Grant's argument. And so therefore they decided to not include any mention of gender or sex, which was hugely disappointing to scores of women and really drove a significant wedge between what had been the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement.
Let me read it in its entirety. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. There's a second section that says Congress can enforce this. It didn't say on the basis of literacy, educational achievement, property ownership, geography, gender, or sex. They could have. Here was a good time to do it. When you open the door this way, you can sometimes squeeze things in that might not pass all by themselves. When this didn't happen, I know from reading the work of Susan B. Anthony and particularly Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the bitterness was huge. What a betrayal, because they had worked extremely hard for suffrage for Black men and for emancipation. And suddenly now, when they're that close to the prize, to see the door slammed in their face, it just seems like now was the time, and I can understand the bitterness.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really was, I think, just a question, honestly, of horse trading, not to make it a callous statement, but I really think that that's what it was. And it was the best way to get the amendment ratified, which, of course, they had to think about at the time, because as they were starting to let states back in, they had to ensure that enough northern states would ratify it that it would start to sort of get the ball rolling. But yeah, it must have been hugely disappointing. And it's important to note that the amendment doesn't say that women can't vote, but we know that unless something is explicitly prohibited in the Constitution, states will often find a way to make it difficult or nearly impossible. It really shifted the movement for women's rights to vote to the state level, at least for a while.
And the argument you're making about that is the same argument one could make about the Equal Rights Amendment, that yes, you could say that nothing that women want to do is necessarily prohibited under the Constitution as it stood, but explicitly endorsing the rights of women and saying that their rights must not be abridged would have been a very strong thing for us to do. That amendment went through Congress, but it has never reached the trigger of 3/4 of the states.
Well, technically it has. The problem is that some states have voted to rescind it, which I don't actually believe that you can do. There's very interesting legal arguments sort of for and against. I don't believe that you can rescind it unless you have a whole new vote.
And yet, no one has declared it passed.
Correct. Not to get on a hobby horse here, but a lot of the things that people warned about, the ERA is, women will have to serve in the military, or women will have to pay alimony, or blah, blah, blah. That's happened, and the world has not fallen apart. So just had to throw my sense in there.
I'm going to go back to the 13th, which abolishes slavery. Here's the full text of that, Lindsay. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So abolishing slavery, that's the first of them, the 13th, 1865. Lincoln helped to get it through. What's arguing is that people that have committed certain types of crimes are in servitude. They're in prisons or in jails, and that is then why we can lock them up, so that otherwise it might have been regarded as a prohibition on any incarceration.
Yeah, and it's also why a lot of times prisoners, especially in places like Louisiana, can actually be made to work while they're in prison. So really sort of horrible, conditions, and often they did have a racial element, especially in the South. So these amendments are by no means perfect. It's very important, and they've had, in a lot of ways, I think, unintended consequences in some fashion.
The war has been won. The South has been vanquished. The 13th Amendment passes in the winter in which the war ended. Abraham Lincoln has been martyred. Am I right to think that if the South had been allowed to return to the Union, but under no conditions, this would not have passed?
There was an argument that was made by actually a lot of Southerners at the time that they were so demoralized immediately after the loss of the war. Most, not all, but most were so demoralized that they really would have accepted any conditions to get back into the nation, and would have accepted any form of Reconstruction because they just wanted to move on. And it was Andrew Johnson's leniency and his willingness to allow a lot of the same social structures to reemerge that gave them hope that resistance was possible. If all the amendments had been there right away from the beginning, like, in some sort of counterfactual, if the 13th, 14th, and 15th had been passed and ratified in 1864 and the war had ended, I don't know that the South would have put up the same fight because it was right after the end. Does that make sense?
Are you saying that this was a new blow after the war? If it had been part of the war aims explicitly, it might have been different?
Well, I don't think it would have been any more popular, but I think that there wouldn't have been the same resistance to it because that resistance took a while to build up as people regained a foothold in society and saw that there were Northerners willing to grant clemency.
Such a sad story, Lindsay. So the 13th Amendment is ratified, seems to take care of the problem. No more slavery. And yet, it sort of depends on how you define your terms, that the South was able to twist everything and to create legal peonage and all sorts of neo-feudal systems, black codes that prevented migration or even mobility. They found a way to, in a sense, continue slavery under a slightly different set of protocols. Is that fair?
Yeah, it was a series of economic and legal and social conditions that recreated this second-tier status for most Black Southerners. And a lot of it was initially done through violence and intimidation that prevented or forcibly encouraged Black Americans to not vote and therefore to not elect Black representatives or Republicans to represent them, which then returned a lot of white Southerners, who usually were Democrats, to power. And they then passed the legal and economic structures that enforced that subservient position.
You can say that slavery's done, but if the spirit of compliance or even acceptance is not there, it's possible to evade that situation, and it was evaded in different ways well into the 20th century. But all of the things that white Southern Confederate America feared, that if you emancipate African American enslaved people, that there will be some sort of degradation and social disintegration and chaos. All those things were bogeys that were thrown up, and it turns out that once we sort of came to terms with all of this in the later half of the 20th century, it's not really true, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, there are exceptions to every rule and every generalization, but 99.9% of the allegations that were made and the concerns about violence and the concerns about degradation of women and all of these things were constructions designed to enforce a social code and a social order that kept a few select rich white men at the top and kept most white men actually in a place of poverty, but they were socially above black men, and so it was fine.
It's just such a long and agonizing story, and it's so heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking that these amendments were all undermined and circumvented, including by the Supreme Court of the United States, including by presidents and even Congresses of the United States.
There are just so many elements that we don't necessarily even think about that affect life in a real and tangible way. And, you know, one of the best explanations when we think about this concept that we talk a lot about called structural racism, one of the best explanations that I've ever heard for that is no one is saying that if you're white, your life has been easy. That's absolutely not what structural racism is. But your life has never been made harder because you are white. And that's not, of course, true in reverse. And so I think that's just, when we think about how long history is and how far back things go, it's really not very long ago at all. And it is important for us to not treat it as though it's so far in the past.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Just one quick example. The interstate highway system, which is one of the glories of American infrastructural boldness, often razed to the ground black communities in our inner cities, partly because they had to veer away from white privileged neighborhoods, but also as social planning to clear out these problem spots. Just get rid of all that bad housing and the density of crime and poverty in those places. And in doing so, put enormous pressure on African Americans living in our cities. And they had no voice in the siting of these highways. And now, 60 years later, we're beginning to have a revision of looking more completely at that structure and no longer seeing it simply from a naive, patriotic, infrastructural point of view. I think you're saying that's really true in almost every walk of American life.
Yeah, I mean, any form of government action, even if super well-intentioned, usually has some cost or repercussion. And that doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen. It just means that we need to think about who is bearing those costs and repercussions. And often the answer is people of color, whether it's Native Americans or African Americans or Mexican Americans or something. And so it's just it's not to say like we shouldn't have highways or we shouldn't have industry. Of course, we have to have these things. We just need to be mindful about the implications of them and making sure they're not always borne most heavily by the same communities.
The other thing to keep in mind about structural racism is that it doesn't mean that the people who planned the interstate highways were terrible racial bigots. It means that they didn't think it through in the same way we would now. They weren't necessarily trying to punish anybody. They were just doing what appeared to them to be the efficient and responsible thing to do. And they didn't step back and say, I wonder what impact this is going to have on these communities that will be most impacted by this new highway.
Well, and sometimes those costs and repercussions aren't even if you did stop to think about it, it's not even necessarily known until later. So, our understanding of how the environment affects our health has improved greatly in the last several decades. Or, another example that I think is really interesting, I did a bit of writing about the spoils system in the last couple of weeks, and I was looking at the history of it and sort of the different arguments, pros and cons, and how it came about. One of the unfortunate consequences of the destruction of the spoils system, which overall is treated as a very good thing. We have the creation of a merit-based civil service. There's less corruption. There's less graft. People are put in jobs that they're qualified for. This is excellent. But the spoils system had actually been used to help give a lot of loyal Black Republicans a leg up after the Civil War. They had been put in positions like postmaster general of like a small little post office in their town, or sort of a base level job, but it was a good start on the economic ladder. And when you no longer had a system that rewarded based purely on party loyalty, those same people were not receiving those same jobs. And so sometimes there are just unintended consequences that we don't even necessarily think about, but are worth at least having a conversation over.
It's one thing the libertarians like to remind us, that every government decision produces winners and losers, that nothing is simple. If it were simple, it wouldn't get to that level of requiring public policy debates and majority rule. So the 15th says that essentially that Black men can vote if they're 21 years old. The southern states said, well, great, but watch what we do. We'll have a poll tax that most African Americans can't afford. That's a head tax, so it's going to cost you $20 to vote. It's going to cost you $5 to vote. Or we'll have a literacy test and show them a complex text, a piece of literature that it's probably they haven't had a chance to be familiar with, and then show that they're not up to it. There were such arbitrary tests as having a big jar of jelly beans and saying how many jelly beans in the jar. And if you guessed 223 and it was actually 412, no, you're out. You can't vote. So there were a range of different ways, not including intimidation, violence, access to polls, etc. But even if you can get into the poll, there was still substantial barriers thrown up precisely to prevent the intentions of the 15th Amendment from coming to pass.
Well, and one of the most important of those rules is there were often what was called grandfather clauses. So if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote. And obviously, if you are a formerly enslaved person, your grandfather is probably, unless your grandfather is a white man, which you wouldn't really be able to prove, you're not going to be able to vote. And so it was a structural impediment. Now, what's really interesting about the 14th and the 15th is that both of these amendments give Congress the ability to pass legislation to enforce these amendments. And we're going to return to the 14th one in the next segment, because that enforcement clause has never been used in the way that it could be, and it's really fascinating. But the 15th, there were enforcement acts that were passed. There were 3. One of them is colloquially known today as the Ku Klux Klan Act, and it is still enforced, is still on the books. And in fact, one of the charges that was brought against former President Trump in, I believe, the D.C. case was under this act, the design to deprive people of the right to vote. And so it is a very powerful tool. It was what Grant used to send federal forces. It is what enabled Eisenhower to send federal forces down to Little Rock to desegregate the schools. It is a very powerful tool that Congress, I believe, should use when the situation warrants it.
The 13th Amendment evaded, the 15th Amendment evaded. I can sort of understand the old Confederacy finding revulsion in these amendments. What I don't understand is when the official establishment of the United States, the Supreme Court, sides with Southern structural or other racism in the way that these amendments are interpreted. We need to take a short break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the 14th Amendment, one of the most complex things that was ever debated and ratified in the history of the United States. I'm with my friend Lindsay Chervinsky. We're talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the post-Civil War amendments. We'll be back to Listening to America in just a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm with my friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, talking about 10 things, or at least a couple of them, relating to the post-Civil War amendments 13, 14, and 15, all passed between and ratified between 1865 and 1870. Really the most fundamental amendments to the Constitution in our history, arguably.
I certainly think there's an argument to be made that the 13th, 14th, and 15th make what we think of the Bill of Rights as attainable in theory for all Americans.
And that takes us to a question I wanted to ask you. It was on my list. Jefferson and Madison. So Jefferson, I don't think, if he remained true to his principles, would be in favor of the 14th Amendment, because I think he would say, no, these are state matters. Each state is a sovereign. What Mississippi does within its own borders, within some broad limits, is perfectly fine as long as it's a republic. Jefferson's a states' rights man. He resisted the consolidation of the national government. That's one of the reasons why he disagreed so much with Hamilton, and one of the reasons why he was lukewarm on the new Constitution. So as a Jefferson scholar, I see this as something that Jefferson would have not only lamented, but maybe fought against. But his best friend Madison was in favor from the beginning of applying the basic protections of the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights to everybody in the country, trumping any state laws or state norms.
Yeah, and I think, the argument that Madison would make is that you can't have fundamentally different laws and rights that apply to citizens of Georgia than apply to citizens of Connecticut. Otherwise, you're not really one nation. You are a lot of nations under one umbrella. And maybe that gets at the heart of the difference between what Jefferson saw as his vision and what Madison saw as his vision. And Madison wanted one nation and maybe Jefferson wanted a bunch. But I think we have, and that's something we are very much still grappling with today. We are still a federal system. States still have a lot of power to shift things and change things over, matters like education and healthcare. And of course, most recently, the topic that has been front and center is that of abortion and women's health, in that the Supreme Court decided to send it back to the states. And so now each state is making this decision in theory for itself. And that leads to very different experiences for women in, say, Texas and California.
The 14th Amendment is the most important in many respects, the most litigated, the one that's the most complex. It has 5 articles. Let me quickly go through them. Number 1, birthright citizenship. If you're born in the United States of America, unless you're a diplomat and certain other very restricted people, you are a citizen of the United States. So birthright citizenship. Second article, there can be a penalty of states that refuse to permit African Americans their franchise and their chance to vote and hold public office, that those states can lose actual representation in Congress for refusing to permit African Americans to vote and hold office. Number 3, the third article says that people who are engaged in the insurrection or any insurrection are disqualified from holding public office in the United States unless both houses of Congress by a 2/3 vote grant an exception. Number 4, the government of the United States will pay off its debts from the war, but there will be no compensation for the debts incurred by the Confederate States, no recompense or compensation to slaveholders who feel that they have now been stripped of their workforce. There's no compensation coming. And then finally, number 5, the Congress has the right to enforce these 4 provisions, that this isn't just a wishful thinking, that the amendment specifically empowers the Congress of the United States to do what it needs to do to enforce birthright citizenship, access to voting, the disqualification of those who have engaged in insurrection, no compensation of any sort to the states and individuals who were engaged in that insurrection.
2 things worth noting. In Section 2, where it says that representatives shall be apportioned among the states based on their citizenship numbers, it's actually a fairly vague clause. It doesn't say that if a state deprives Black men or white women, it says citizens. So I have a query, which is, what about states that gerrymander the crap out of their map and people are being deprived of their vote? How does that fit under the 14th Amendment? Point 2, in the 4th section, when it says the validity of public debt, it says suppression of insurrection or rebellion. It does not specify the Civil War. So what that says is that public debt has to be paid, no matter what. When it talks about insurrection in Section 3, in terms of no one who has participated in any insurrection can hold office, again, it does not specify the Civil War. So these amendments, they are obviously crafted with the Civil War in mind, but it does not only apply in the language to that conflict.
Right, so it's backward focused to a certain degree, but forward possible. It doesn't say, and it ends with the the late war. This is a general principle that now is enshrined at the heart of the Constitution of the United States. And as I said before, there are some really interesting contemporary concerns about all of this. So the validity of the public debt. Back in the spring when Congress was deciding whether to increase the debt ceiling, and now again in a few weeks, the 14th Amendment would seem to say, hey, you got to pay your debt. That's not optional. That's got to be done. That's a constitutional provision. It's not a norm. It's not a habit. It's not optional, that the Constitution says that the validity of the public debt cannot be abridged. And so the argument has been made, not with great effect, I think, that Congress has no choice and should stop monkeying around with this sort of thing, because there's your 14th Amendment. As to insurrection, the notion has been invoked around the country in different ways that President Trump is no longer eligible to stand for the presidency because he was part of an insurrection. I want your opinion. I think that one's a little dicey since he has not been convicted of any crimes and maybe never will be, but it seems to me that you have to have a standard of what an insurrection is, and you can't just say that the people who were manning the barricades during the Vietnam War were in an insurrection. I mean, you have to be pretty careful about how you target that, right?
Yeah, you do. I mean, there are so many different aspects of this argument that are contested. So the first is this a self-executing clause, or does it require some sort of case? So for example, you cannot be president if you are under 35 years of age. That's kind of a self-executing clause. People can challenge it, but it doesn't require you have some sort of court case. A lot of legal scholars make the argument that this is also self-executing, that if you have been involved in the insurrection, it is self-executing, you are no longer eligible. And interestingly, actually, there was a candidate, I think he was in New Mexico, who was a candidate for a local office that was ruled ineligible because he participated in the January 6th insurrection, I think. If I'm remembering my details correctly. The second piece of it that is unclear is, as you said, do you need to be convicted of the charge of insurrection, or do you need to be convicted of a charge related to an insurrection? These are questions that have not been tested. The third piece is the president an office of the United States? And there are some legal arguments that make the claim that the president is not explicitly articulated, whereas congressmen and other offices are, and so therefore the president does not apply. I don't really buy that last piece. I think the first two questions are worth thinking about.
My own view of this, Lindsay, is that this is an interesting subject for people like Lawrence Tribe and others to discuss at the Inns of Court or at the Oxford Union, but it's a mistake to try to use this as a way of preventing Donald Trump from standing for the presidency again. I think it's dicey. It's on fairly thin constitutional ground, and it will appear to be exactly what he always says, that the deep state is looking for any way to prevent a second term for him. I think it would be better just to let the voters decide this. There's a couple of things. First of all, as to presidents being held accountable for their civil actions or their actions in office that are not criminal. Jefferson is part of that precedent with the Batur case when he was sued after he left the presidency. He wrote a beautiful defense of himself, saying the president really can't be held accountable for things he does as a policymaker. If we were a republic, some of our former presidents would have gone to prison. And this one, I think, certainly. If we were a republic, we would say no. I mean, it doesn't matter if you are the richest person who ever lived, if you're the most beautiful man who ever lived. No, if you committed the crimes, it's person X, person Y, person Z. That's a republic. But we're not quite that republic. There are certain echoes of monarchy, dictatorship, imperialism that are at the center of our national life, and I think it's going to be interesting to watch. I mean, here's my prediction. I think that former President Trump will be convicted on several of the criminal charges. I don't know what will happen then. Let's say that he is sentenced to go to a minimum security sort of gentleman's prison somewhere. It's hard to think that that could be, but it could. What do you most fear in all of this?
Well, I take your point that we have imperfectly applied the small r Republican values to our former presidents. But if anything, these amendments should be a lesson that you have to keep trying, and you have to keep trying to make it better. And, we had the amendments and they weren't really working. So then we had civil rights legislation in the 1960s, and we continued to have to try and push and make it better. And so I don't think we should ever give up of trying to be more in accordance with small r Republican values, even if we fail. If I had to guess, I do believe he will be convicted. The evidence in certain cases is just overwhelming. The judge is slow rolling the case down in Mar-a-Lago with the documents case, but that's really an obstruction of justice case. And the evidence appears to be just open and shut. I think he'll probably be convicted in the March case. I think you're right. He will be sentenced to one of these club fed things. It will then, of course, go up for appeal. And then that case will hinge entirely on the outcome of the election. Because if he is elected president again, he will order the Justice Department to dismiss the cases. Probably try and pardon himself, and that has never been tested. I don't think that the founders would have accepted the concept that you could self-pardon, but again, this is uncharted territory, and so until it's tested and enforced in some way, we don't know what's going to happen. So really what I think it's all going to come down to is what happens with the election.
So let's say that in April of 2024 he is convicted in one or more of these cases. How worried are you that people will take AR-15s into the streets?
I am concerned about it. I think it's impossible not to be. I am slightly heartened that the responses to the indictments have been lackluster, and I think that's largely attributable to the strong response by the Department of Justice in arresting people and indicting people and charging people and securing convictions for those who were involved in the January 6th insurrection. Demonstrating that there are consequences is very important. I'm more concerned about what we would call quote unquote like lone wolf violence than I am large scale insurrection. I'm concerned about assassination. I'm concerned about bombs. I'm concerned about people who are trying to effect retribution on an individual scale as opposed to a widespread one, because those often are much harder to predict and protect against. Whereas, for example, if a jury comes back, the court is going to be armed to the teeth, ready for some sort of large response. It's the individual ones that are a lot harder to protect against.
I agree. I think we will, I hate to say it, but I think we will see assassinations. I think we will see beatings, kidnappings. But I think it's mostly the rogue person who is sort of ripe for that sort of paramilitary activity anyway. I don't see violence on every major city in this country, a week after or a day after a conviction. But I do think there'll be some. All right, we don't have a lot of time left. What was the point of the 14th Amendment? The founders of the 14th Amendment, what were they actually trying to get at here, Lindsay?
They were trying to extend the rights of citizenship to people that were born and raised in the nation and make it very clear that your skin color was not the predominant factor for determining citizenship. One of the challenges, and we talked about sort of 14th and 15th, is the 14th was then sort of interpreted immediately after its ratification as a due process amendment. So in terms of things like search and seizure, right to trial by jury, the right to participate in juries, things like that, which are very important and essential to citizenship, but are not all of citizenship. And it was also to defend over this is the piece of the 14th Amendment that I think that we've lost a lot because it's sort of distant from our historical memory. It was to give people bodily autonomy over who they were. So there was a very clear understanding that part of enslavement was not just that you were forced to labor. It was that you had no control over your marriage, you had no control over your body, and you had no control over your children. And so the 14th Amendment was designed to protect those rights for Black men and women to marry who they wanted. Well, in reality, that meant to marry other people of color because there were still miscegenation laws, to have control over their children so that they could not be sold away, and to have bodily autonomy over themselves so that they could not be forced to engage in sexual activity with people that they did not wish. Now, of course, these were all imperfectly enforced. A lot of the violence in the South had a sexual connotation to it as part of the attempts to keep people from voting, but that was the intent.
Fair enough. A conservative court, and we have one now, can chip away at things that you would think would be covered under the provisions of the 14th Amendment. If it were a different kind of court, if it were, say, the Warren Court, they would be using the 14th Amendment to insist upon certain rights and standards that at the moment appear to be being eroded. So it's one thing to do this. It all depends upon two things. It depends upon the people's willingness to abide by the clear language of the amendment, and more importantly, it depends upon our judicial system to interpret and enforce them in the manner that they were intended. And it always strikes me as really odd that all these people who say they're originalists are quite willing to distort the clear understanding, the clear intentions of the 14th Amendment.
Yes, well, that would require reading the facts, which is inconvenient. So I think there are 4 Supreme Court cases that are really important to think about in terms of the 14th Amendment and how it has been interpreted. There are, of course, more than that, but there are 4 that I think really demonstrate how the Supreme Court has undermined citizenship protections and voting rights protections. So the first came almost right after the 14th Amendment, and it was called the Slaughterhouse cases. And to make a very long story short, basically it ruled that you had a right to liberty, you did not have a right to economic prosperity. So what that meant was the state could establish a monopoly, in this case a slaughterhouse monopoly, and that wasn't depriving economic rights to other slaughterhouses. Number two is the Lochner case. The Lochner cases basically said that the state did not have a right to limit the number of hours that people could be forced to work because that was depriving people of their right to liberty. And this is really the start of when the Supreme Court starts to see the 14th Amendment through business interests lens, and was really essential for the Supreme Court turn away from civil rights. The third case is Plessy versus Ferguson, which says separate but equal, that as long as you have equal facilities and opportunities for people of different colors, then it's totally fine. Of course, we know this was bogus.
As long as the black school is as good as the white school and everyone has access, that's okay under Plessy versus Ferguson. Number 4.
Number 4 is a recent one, and it's the Rousseau case. And it was the case that was decided by mostly this Supreme Court, or similar to the Supreme Court, that said that political gerrymandering is fine, racial gerrymandering is not. And political gerrymandering has to be resolved through political means. So in other words, you might be gerrymandered out of your political influence. That's tough. You have to use your political influence to fix it.
Right. So just in the shortest possible compass, because we are out of time, and I thank you for this really interesting program, Lindsay. Birthright citizenship. What was the original intent of birthright citizenship?
Anyone that was born in the United States gets to be a citizen.
And so today, anyone born in the United States gets to be a citizen. And, we talk about tourism birthing and, cross the border overnight and give birth and so on. There's an attempt to undo a lot of that in some quarters, but the clear meaning is what the clear meaning was. You're born in this country, unlike in many, many other countries. You are a U.S. citizen.
It's one of the clearest parts, actually, of these amendments.
Agreed. Thank you so much. We'll talk again. I love this series, 10 Things. Today, 10 things about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the post-Civil War amendments. We'll meet again in a couple of weeks, but for all the rest of you, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.